Hello, I'm Jonathan Fine, a long-time tech user and developer. Every Thursday this year, I've held a Zoom Tech Hour. Every second Thursday of the month, we focus on accessibility. Our three guests today are Jonathan, Paulius, and Jana. Paulius is going to be arriving a little bit late. All three are blind or visually impaired and have contributed greatly to the Tech Hour. I've learned a lot from them about accessibility, and I'm sure that you'll learn from what they have to say. Can we start with Jonathan? Jonathan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. It's Jonathan Godfrey speaking. I'm a senior lecturer in statistics at Massey University, Palmerston North, New Zealand. I have been a senior lecturer for 5 years, 10 years as a lecturer before that, following completion of my PhD in statistics and other qualifications. I studied mathematics, statistics, economics, and operations research at university, and in my undergraduate years, I would call myself a person with low vision. I used my residual vision to read things through closed-circuit television technology, but by the time I finished my master's degree, my reading speed was absolutely pathetic and debilitating. All of the research work that I did for my own PhD was done as what I would describe as a totally blind person. I have some light perception, but no functional vision with respect to print, including mathematics, music, etc. When I finished my master's degree and it was obvious that I was going to do a PhD, the ability to write mathematical content was a hurdle that I had to know how I was going to overcome. The mainstream software of the day that everyone else was using in terms of word processing was not going to work in terms of writing the mathematical expressions I needed to write. That meant that I didn't really have a choice. If I wanted any form of access to the mathematics I was writing, it was LaTeX or nothing. I found my entry into LaTeX empowering. I was in control of all the things I wanted to write. I was not in control, though, of what my audience was going to read. I had no way of verifying that what I thought I was creating was in fact meaningful at all. And in the 20 years since that time, very little has changed for LaTeX. About 10 years ago, I discovered that I could take LaTeX documents and convert them into HTML using MathML to present the mathematics and using the very early stages of MathJax as well. And so that was about the first time when I was able to start independently verifying what I was writing. The hardware that I use in terms of reading mathematics and the software I use comes down to two things. The software is screen reading technology. I use both JAWS and NVDA at times. And the only hardware I have in addition to what anyone else uses around my office is the Braille display that is sitting on my desk at work. I would interact with everything I write and read probably well north of 99% of the time using audio and only occasionally resorting to the Braille display to generally to check the accuracy of my syntax, to check the spelling of other people's work, and things that are just easier in Braille than are often possible in audio. In more recent years, as a R user, I have mostly converted everything that I ever did in LaTeX into R Markdown. I'm using R Markdown because the outcome format that is the primary focus is HTML. And the process of getting from Markdown to HTML is quite simple as compared to the process of taking raw LaTeX documents and converting those to HTML. The PDF documents that LaTeX generates are still as useless to me today in 2021 as they were in 1998 when I started my PhD work. I personally find that quite disappointing. I loved LaTeX for what it gave me 20 years ago. It gave me the power to finish a PhD. It gave me the power to start my career as a lecturer. But in the end, my ability to perform in my work today is greatly enhanced because I use LaTeX for the mathematical expressions inside my Markdown documents, and I use all the skills that I developed in learning and using LaTeX. All those skills have been now turned into transferable knowledge for managing my bibliographic referencing and mathematical expressions in Markdown. I still deal with occasional legacy documents that were written in LaTeX. I still deal with the work written by other authors in LaTeX, but I'm now only reading the raw text file that they started with in exactly the same fashion I did 20 years ago. Raw LaTeX is slow to read as compared to raw Markdown and other various formats that other blind people have tried to encourage use of over that time. I wouldn't be where I am today without LaTeX.
I'd like to move on now to Jana, and I'd like to give you a word of reassurance, which is that many of the people at this conference are coders, so you can very comfortably talk about your experience with coding and software, writing software. So I think over to you, Jana.
Hi, my name is Jana Schroeder, and I live in Indiana in the United States. I come from a background of working in the field of higher education, working in student services, and doing nothing to do with math or computers except as a user at the user end of things. However, during the pandemic, in the middle of 2020, my job was eliminated and I found myself unemployed for the first time in my life. I was considering what I wanted to do next and trying to think about a career that was likely to have lots of opportunities. And I started to look into the field of computer coding. I knew that I was a pretty logical person and liked to think through things step by step. And I had not ever tried coding, but I thought it might be something that I could do. As a totally blind person, I talked to some other blind coders and tried to find out what kinds of things I needed to keep in mind. Many of them, I got the strong impression that they had had to figure out things on their own or with the help of a professor or some people who were able to be really helpful to them, but that they didn't have a lot of knowledge or texts or anything like that to rely on. I also found that many of them were not very favorable for the boot camp type program that I was thinking of going to. I did this because it was something that the state of Indiana would pay for in terms of my retraining so that I could find employment. And it was a 3-month coding boot camp that was completely online. What I use as a totally blind person on the computer is a screen reader, and I use JAWS, and I also use, as others do, a Braille display. I've been reading Braille since I was in 1st grade, so I'm very fluent and quick with Braille. But what a screen reader does is not just read everything that's on the screen sort of in order as one might think, but there are lots of different keystrokes and special ways of navigating the screen and doing things with particular keystrokes that make it a lot quicker. So I often find myself using the screen reader as my first method of reading if I'm just reading an article or working on a document in prose. However, I felt that having a Braille display would be very helpful with coding, where I would need to pay lots of attention to the syntax, the punctuation, the indentation, things like that. And so I was glad that I had that available to me. I embarked on the boot camp, and I had to learn a whole bunch of different things at once. Of course, my classmates were doing this too, but for me, learning a new system, and the ones that we were using included Visual Studio and GitHub. Those types of systems for me required that I memorize or first learn a lot of different keystrokes and what they would do, how they would move me from function to function, or how they would help me in error checking. Whereas my sighted classmates had lots of cues that helped them pick it up very naturally, like things being in different colors so that they could very easily see if they had correctly formatted something so that it was what they had intended it to be. So I had to learn that in addition to learning all of the terminology and the concepts and the ideas behind coding. To make a fairly long story short, although I enjoyed what I was doing and I felt like I was getting a grasp on the concepts behind it, I was not able to keep up with the pace of the boot camp in terms of output and needing to produce code quickly enough. And so I had to drop out of that course. And since then, I have not given up on the idea of wanting to do coding, but I have tried to reach out to a lot of different people and learn how they learn to code and what resources there were for them. And I've also looked at online resources that are available. Some of the main challenges that I have found in getting learning materials that work for me are a couple of things. One is that a lot of times when you're reading online. There will be a lot of good explanatory text that's very readable with my screen reader, but then there will be screenshots to illustrate the actual coding language that is being that's being invoked at a certain point. There are some things I can do with my screen reader to try to interpret that text. And this is a really new development with screen readers within the last year or two, which makes it a lot better than it has been, but it's still not perfect, especially when there is a crowded screen with a lot of material on it. It does not do a very good job of interpreting that. The other big problem that I ran into was I'm working with the instructor of my course, as well as with videos that I would find online, is that when they wanted people to code along, they might give certain cues as to what they were typing in, but they also relied on the fact that people could watch what they were typing in on their screen and could copy that. And while there were ways for me to get to some of that information, for example, using with Visual Studio Code, there's a way to share your screen and do a live session with others where you're working. That was still not fast enough because I had to switch from the screen that they were working in and then get back to my input screen. And so that was slower than what other people were able to do. I also found that working with the Visual Studio Code and the live sessions, that it was not a very robust system. And so oftentimes there would be a lockup at my end, and I would stop following what the person was inputting, and I'd have to, go and reinitialize the session. And so that made it difficult to stay caught up with what was being coded. So I just found that while it's possible for blind people to code, and I know that there are many successful people who are blind coders, that the entry point is pretty steep, and that there hasn't been a lot of progress in making that so that any blind person who is interested has a fair shot at learning coding and making a real career of it.
There's some, I've been taking notes because that's what I do in sessions like this. And there's a couple of comments that I would like to make that tie together Jana's and my experiences. So there's three of them, and the third actually follows on from the second. I think one of the most important tools that blind people have available to them today that I did not have access to 20-something years ago is the ability to reach out in real time to other blind people who are successfully using tools and can guide us towards using the most accessible tools for blind people. And so the active encouragement that we can get because we know that we aren't the first person to try something is a hugely valuable thing for us to be able to have. In the days before we did not have the ability to reach out, and I have to accept that some blind people still don't reach out as much as they possibly should, every blind person had to go and find the solution for themselves. We duplicated effort without knowing how to save ourselves a lot of time, and we all learnt lessons the hard way. Screen readers that blind people use are very good at dealing with the most commonly used commercial products and environments that the general public want to be using. So screen readers are very good at dealing with web content as compared to other content. So text that is in an HTML document is very, very easily worked with by blind people and their screen reading software. That's true also for plain text files. It's more difficult for documents written using other proprietary formats. It is more difficult for the developers of screen readers to actually keep pace with the changes in those proprietary formats and the interfaces from the big commercial software giants. And so the experience at times in even the most modern word processing environments that our colleagues might be using is somewhat below par. So to be at the cutting edge and on par with our cited colleagues, the more we are working in an HTML environment, the more we and our colleagues are working in an HTML environment, the greater the parity that we have with our colleagues. The documentation that helps get people into using particular software is of crucial importance. If every document that helps you learn how to use a particular programming language or typesetting language, if that's all produced in unreadable formats like PDF coming out of LaTeX, then the challenges associated with learning those languages become almost insurmountable. When I first started learning LaTeX, there was no HTML documentation available at all. The web pages would be pointing towards a PDF document or a printed document to go and fetch out of the library. And so I had a copy of Lamport available, but to use Lamport, I had to have someone who understood what was written in Lamport to give me the guidance that I needed. And in 2021, no one ought to start their LaTeX journey with a printed document like Lamport. It's just too damn hard to bother starting with. Thankfully, there are any number of wiki pages or HTML resources that offer very good starts into using LaTeX. Similarly, into using other mathematical software that we have to use, statistical software as well. Some of that documentation for mathematical and statistical software is as bad today as it was 20 years ago. Some communities, the R community, the Python community, people who use SAS, and a few other software options in mathematics and statistics are providing documentation that is easily read by blind people using screen readers. And for my money, the lack of documentation is one of the main reasons that I cross software off the list of viable options. I cannot be bothered fighting for 1 week to learn how to use something that my colleagues can pick up in 10 minutes because the documentation is not available. I would rather go and use something that is accessible to me and my screen reader now, because that's the time frame that my sighted colleagues are working in. They're working now. They're not working next week when they can find a human to read them things. It's now or it's never.
Well, Jane has kindly agreed to give a summary of this session and make closing remarks. But first, I'd like to remind you that there's an Accessibility Tech Hour next Thursday focused on technical and human obstacles to accessible tech. Human includes social. Jana, I wonder if you're able to make some remarks about the forums, the blind math list and the visually impaired programmers list? And perhaps if you want to, what role for sighted coders as assistants to the blind community? So over to you, Jana. I've given you a hot potato.
Thanks. There are a couple of really good resources for blind programmers and mathematicians, and those are primarily through internet mailing lists, email mailing lists, and we will provide the URLs for the two most popular, which is Program L and Blind Math. These are groups of people who are both professionals in these fields and also people who are students and wanting to learn, and they're able to ask questions, get help, find out about resources, and that has been an extremely valuable thing that has not always been available to blind people, and makes it much easier for us all over the world to be in contact with one another and sharing what is happening. I think that there are two levels that I'd like to address in terms of how sighted people can be of assistance. The first level is a very short-term level, and the second is a more long-term one. For short-term, there are often times when things are just not accessible. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, there are sometimes screenshots that will be there and I just can't read them, and I just need a set of eyes to be able to tell me something that's on the screen. And so oftentimes being able to call upon someone, and there are a couple of services for the blind that allow one to get a sighted assistant who can look at your computer screen and give you information. Oftentimes those people are not familiar with coding or math, and so that is what slows us down. If we have more people who are knowledgeable to help with that kind of thing, it could alleviate things that are quickly fixed, that we just need a pair of eyes so that we can move on in whatever task that we're doing and complete it. But in the long term, what we really need is an understanding by developers and by people who are creating content and documentation of accessibility and how to make sure that the information and the programs that they are producing are accessible for people using screen readers. And that's something that I'd just love to see more commitment to. I have heard that supposedly in universities where people, at least in the States, where people are learning computer programming, that they are supposed to be learning about accessibility, but many people report that what they learn is extremely limited and is not practical in terms of them actually being able to apply it. So that is what we need, is a much better understanding and built in from the get-go, so that you don't have to go back and fix something that is not accessible. If things are accessible, and the more they become accessible, the less I need to look to other resources like sighted people to help with reading. I think that the long-term goal would be that when a new product comes out, we do not have to worry, as we do now, about whether we're going to be able to use it. Is the new version or the update going to have broken something with accessibility that will put us back? Or is it simply a matter that things have not been updated, things have not changed, as Jonathan referred to in terms of his experiences where 20 years and there has not been an improvement. And I think that both of us are saying that in some ways it's the best of times and it's the worst of times, because it's wonderful that there are tools out there that allow us to learn and to do work that we want to do in the STEM fields. It's also frustrating that those are always lagging behind what's available to the mainstream audience who does not need accessibility and adaptations. I think that we both want to emphasize that this is completely doable and that there really needs to be attention paid to creating ways for people to learn where each individual coming into the learning process doesn't have to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel. There are ways that we can learn these systems, and there are ways that they can be improved to make them even better for us to use. And that is what we really want to advocate for, and make sure that there are people, much more widespread awareness of the needs that we have, which are often different than the needs that sighted people assume that we have. So really, what I have loved about this past year and being part of the TeX hours is that there's really a desire to learn from and put the voices of the blind persons at the forefront, and to use us as the experts who can say, this is what we need, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, and to then think about how can we as sighted people be allies to try to make that more come to fruition, so that we can even the playing field for people who want to work in these fields who are blind.